but she simply replies that this is the best bed in the carriage, despite being so. She quickly falls asleep, and Fate compares her with a child. He then remembers she said she was a ghost who wasn't allowed to die, and that she has something to do. He asks Greed what Mine is fighting against, but Greed doesn't reply. Fate complains, but Greed simply answers that he will see it if he stays with her. Still, Fate thinks this will become troublesome in the future. Meanwhile, Roxy's companions ask when they should be getting to Galia. Roxy replies it's literally just around the corner. A few minutes later they arrive at Barbados village. They talk about the castle and the story that now a lick monster rules it. They decide to get closer to the castle but notice there is no monsters. Mugen thinks they cleared this place recently. Barbados arrives to introduce himself, and Mugen shows his respect, mentioning Barbados is known as the Sword Saint. Roxy tries to introduce herself, but Barbados mentions she has grown well. She's initially confused, but Barbados replies he knew her parents, that they asked him to name her. She's surprised to hear that, but Mugen mentions how he envies because she has a hero as a godfather. Barbados corrects them, mentioning he's a former hero. He mentions that he retired because he lost his reason to fight due to losing his family. Roxy then mentions that he managed to defeat the Lick Lord, but Barbados replies he didn't do it alone. He simply mentions it's all thanks to a person who fought alongside him. Mugen mentions the person should be a strong warrior because it's not easy to defeat a crowned monster. Miria also says that she wants to meet him, but Barbados simply replies that he left on his journey. Roxy asks for the warrior's name because she will need to report the situation later. However, Barbados refused to say it's Fate. This is because Fate asked him to not mention his name to anyone who asks for him. Roxy accepts this answer and apologizes for disturbing him. She decides to leave, and Barbados asks if she's heading to Galia. She's surprised because she never mentioned it. Barbados replies that's the only reason why she would be in this place. He asks if Eris is behind her mission, but she replies that she volunteered. He tells her that this is all planned because both Hart and Barbados' families are threats to the Velaric. Roxy replies she will carry her father's wishes and protect people. Barbados is shocked to hear that her father passed away. Due to the current situation, Barbados asks if she wants to take lessons from him. She's confused, but he promises to teach her how to fight in Galia. She accepts to learn from him, and Barbados is impressed that not only she has the same type of sword as her father, but also the skills. She says that she wants to be stronger, and they continue their lessons. Meanwhile, Fate is complaining to Mine that they have been walking for a while since the last town. He's confused about this place, and notices that it's full of ruins. Mine replies this is where she was born. Fate is confused but she explains further. She was taken to the imperial capital after she was born, and she doesn't have memories of this place. But still, this is an important place to her. Fate is confused and asks if Galia wasn't destroyed 400 years ago. But Mine ignores and walks away. She stops at a random site, mentioning she found it. Fate is confused, but when he looks ahead, he sees some sort of cocoon. Greed even mentions he cannot believe one of those things are still alive. Mine starts walking again and Fate follows her, while asking Greed what is that. Greed replies it's a chimera. It's a military weapon created in Galia a long time ago by patching monsters as the core. Fate is confused, but Greed explains this is their greatest failure. They get near to it with Greed mentioning that he thought that every chimera was disabled. Mine then turns to Fate and mentions he will be paying her the favor. Fate is a bit shocked because they will have to defeat this. He checks its stats, just to find out that its lowest stat is 14 million. He also notices the chimera skills appear as error. Greed explains that it's unstable because the monster's skills are artificially mixed. Despite the huge stats, Mine mentions this is still a child chimera, so it should be possible to defeat it. Fate is confused and asks what he should do. Mine replies that chimeras won't die by just simply being beaten. As long as it has a soul, it will always stay alive. Fate realizes that she needs his gluttony's soul-eating ability to deal with it. She replies with yes, mentioning it's the most sinful power to defy God. Without waiting, she jumps, saying they will be starting. She strikes the egg, and we see a girl inside. Suddenly, a monster comes out, and Fate notices the girl in the monster's chest. He notices how her eyes looks just like his, but Mine says the monster is trying to intimidate him. Greed even tells Fate to look the other way, otherwise he will lose his will to fight. Fate asks Mine who's that girl, and she replies it's the chimera's core. In short, Mine reveals she needs him to give the finishing blow to the core. Fate tries refuse it by explaining that if he eats her soul, the girl will be suffering in eternal hell. Mine tells him to not be deceived, because the girl is a monster in human form. She then says that his sentimentality will lead to his own death. The monster roars and Mine grabs Fate to dodge the attack. The monster summons lava, and Fate asks Greed to become a scythe and cut it. Greed refuses because he cannot cut that attack. Mine then suddenly stops and tells him to stay behind her. She slashes the lava and stops the attack. She then claims they must split up and slices the monster's arms. Fate tries to stall time by using his petrification arrows, but Greed tells him to focus because the monster is already regenerating. Fate is confused, but Greed explains chimeras were built to fight independently for eternity. Fate doesn't know how they can even defeat it, but Mind slices the monster's arm again. He notices how she's more powerful than before, and Greed explains it's all about her weapon, Sloth. The more she swings Sloth, the stronger and heavier it gets. The chimera shouts in pain, and Fate starts to feel some heavy pressure. Mind lands next to him, explaining the chimera is trying to evolve. Suddenly, wings appear from the chimera's back. Mind orders Fate to stay behind her back, and he gets reminded of Roxy. He realizes that he's being protected again and feels disgusted with himself. He proudly said that he wanted to help Roxy, but in the end, he's always being protected by someone. He wants to change and become stronger, so he tells Mind that he's going to unleash his half-starvation mode. Mind simply replies that if he makes a mistake, he will be swallowed by the gluttony. Fate knows it, but he doesn't care. He cannot help her if he doesn't activate it. He activates his skill and tries his best to control it. However, that comes with a big pain. The chimera doesn't wait and attacks, but Mind blocks it. Suddenly, she hears Fate's voice mentioning it's time to strike back. The chimera attacks with feathers that will explode on contact, and Fate decides to use them to their advantage. He uses Greed to cut the feathers and create an explosion. He then leaps into the air and turns Greed into a bow. He used the dust cloud to charge Greed with 10% of his stats, plus sandstorm magic. Upon shooting, the chimera gets petrified. Mind uses this chance to attack and unleashes Sloth. Her attack is so powerful that she cuts the chimera's feet. Greed tells Fate to hurry up and attack before it regenerates. However, the chimera activates a barrier skill. Fate decides to cut it using his scythe, but it does nothing. Greed orders him to find the flow of mana and hit the weak point. Fate quickly finds it and hits it, damaging the chimera's core. However, he notices the girl is looking away and backs away. He decides to avoid eye contact and leaps away, but that just allows the chimera to fly away. He lands and notices that his eye is bleeding. Greed explains his time is almost up, since there isn't much time. Mind tells him to get on her weapon. He's confused, but she explains she will launch him into the air so that he can defeat the chimera before it regenerates. He follows her instructions and she throws him away. Still, this stupid dude accepts to be launched, but doesn't know how to defeat it. Greed gives him the promo of the day. For 20% of his stats, he can the second stage ultimate. Fate accepts the deal, and the scythe evolves. Greed explains their target is the center of mana. Fate analyzes and finds out the center of mana is the girl. However, the chimera traps him inside its shield barrier. The chimera's plan is to burn itself and take Fate with it. Without much time, Fate starts spinning in midair, combined with flames, and pierces the girl. This creates a huge explosion, but something strange happens to him. First, his telepathy skill activates, and he sees both the chimera core girl and Mind hugging each other. Second, his gluttony skill activates, but instead of the usual excitement, he feels lonely. Greed explains that's how it works. He reveals that the chimera core is an inferior version, but in the end, it's one of Fate's kin. Meanwhile, Mind is simply watching the chimera core girl turn into stone and falling. Fate lands and approaches Mind, asking if she knew the girl. Mind explains she has forgotten what happened a long time ago, but once they become a chimera, they must defeat them. Because if they don't, more people will die. Fate starts to realize that he also could become a lunatic who goes on a rampage. So, he decides to ask Mind for a favor. If one day, he loses himself to gluttony, he wants her to kill him, because he knows she's the only who can kill him if he goes berserk. Mind then walks towards him and hugs him. Fate is confused, but she explains that she will do it when it comes the time. In the aftermath, Fate mentions he will be heading to Babylon and asks about Mind. She mentions that she still has to build a village for her people. He's confused because he didn't expect that was a true story. However, she mentions she has a certain feeling about him. She mentions that Fate will be dead before they meet again. He's confused about it. Turns out that Fate decided to reset his stats to unlock Greed's shield mode. In short, his current stats are all back to 1. Therefore, she thinks he will die soon. He realizes his mistake and asks her help to hunt and raise his stats. However, she walks away and asks for money. He manages to reach Babylon a few hours later, but Greed is complaining because Fate is heading to the wrong gate. Fate turns away and asks if Greed has been here before. Greed confirms, mentioning his previous wielder was also a deadly skin user. They finally enter the city, but there's a problem. Fate is a glutton and the food prices are 5 times higher than the capital. The Holy Knights arrive at the same time, and Fate puts on his mask before he sees Roxy from a distance. Fate explains that every type of warriors come to Babylon. It can be from mercenaries who have a grudge against Holy Knights and even former Holy Knights. Greed then says that as long as he's strong, he will be forgiven. That's how Babylon works, because they want anyone to help them defeat the monsters. Fate realizes this is the best place for him to stay. Meanwhile, Roxy meets another Holy Knight named Alistar. He claims to be honored to be working with her, the heir of Hart family. Roxy thanks him for taking care of Babylon after her father passed away. Alistar stays humble, mentioning he couldn't help her father despite being fighting beside him. He apologizes to her, and she asks if he was there during his final moments. Alistar confirms, and Roxy tells him to keep his head up because she's there to carry on her father's will. She promises that together they will protect the people from the monster's invasion. They shake hands, but Miria thinks that Alistar is looking at Roxy with a perverted look. She wants to save her because she considers Roxy is in danger, but Mugen stops her, mentioning she will lose her head. Roxy then turns to Mugen and Miria, saying they will be inspecting the town. Meanwhile, Fate is walking around while thinking about his finances. It costs 100 gold coins per day to stay in an inn, and 1 gold coin for breakfast. Suddenly, Greed tells him to stop and look left. He sees a store display, and Greed claims the scabbard is calling for him. Fate thinks it looks expensive, but Greed replies they can get money by beating monsters. The store owner comes out, asking if Fate is looking for something. However, he suddenly starts to act like a freak, checking out Fate's cloak. He notices the burn marks, and thinks it was caused by a fireball or a powerful heat attack. Fate is pretty impressed because the guy noticed it right away. Greed claims this guy is talented and they can trust him, but he's only interested in getting the scabbard. Fate gives in and asks how much the scabbard is. The guy replies that's just a sample and he can make one that fits the sword. Fate then handles Greed and asks what he can do. The guy checks the sword, mentioning he never saw a one-handed sword like that. He calls Greed fantastic, making the sword get all cocky. The guy then starts to think what kind of scabbard he can make to match Greed. He has some idea, but it will cost 500 gold coins. Fate is shocked and refuses the deal by running out of the shop. Greed simply tells him to hunt monsters and get some funds, but Fate still thinks 500 gold coins is a rip-off. He considers the princes in the city to be really high, and he doesn't think he should spend that much. He decides to head out and hunt some monsters when he's approached by some guys. They ask if he wants to join them in hunting monsters, since another pair of hands isn't too much. He asks if Fate wants to enlist the army as a volunteer, but Fate simply rejects it. He won't be joining any group. The group leader apologizes and wonders if Fate is a former holy knight because he wants to go solo. Fate is confused, but the guy simply mentions he never guessed it because he looks shabby. He apologizes as if he was afraid and walks away. Greed tells Fate that he needs to dress up properly, otherwise he will have to deal with people like that. Fate cannot believe he must dress up just for self-preservation. He claims that he will be getting something cool, but first they must hunt. After walking for a bit, he reaches a deserted piece of land. Greed explains that Galia is just beyond the border. Fate complains about the smell, but Greed explains that's because there are dead monsters everywhere. Fate continues walking, but there's something strange in the air. Greed explains that spores. Fate is confused when he sees some moss on the rocks, but Greed explains their spores contain poison. He advises Fate to not breathe it, but Fate complains that he should have warned him much earlier. Greed explains that if he inhales too much, the moss will grow roots inside Fate's lungs. Fate gets scared, but Greed simply replies this is Galia. Fate continues walking, and Greed detects a small-scale stampede right away. Fate tries to look around but cannot find it. Suddenly, some orcs appear in the horizon. Greed explains they're the most common monsters in Galia, and they use nature weapons. Greed identifies 50 monsters, and tells that orcs are smart and attack in coordination. Therefore, Fate should treat it like fighting against people. Fate accepts the advice and decides to put what Barbados taught him into practice. He rushes in, but he suddenly sees one orc being headshotted by an arrow. The group from before appears and starts the attack. Fate stops, thinking they were quicker, but Greed complains. He tells Fate to snatch their prey for the sake of his luxury. Fate tries to reason, mentioning it's bad manners to steal monsters from other people. However, Greed simply replies there's no rules or manners when it comes to monster hunting. Suddenly, more orcs appear. Greed explains there's 2 squadrons of them as reinforcements. Fate is still acting like a good boy, and thinks he can deal with them since it won't be considered stealing. Greed uses this chance to mock Fate, calling him an ally of justice. Fate rushes in, using his speed to get as close as possible, but the orcs shoot some fire arrows. Fate turns Greed into a shield that destroys the arrows. Greed explains that this new form repels any physical and magical attacks. He asks Fate to praise him, but our boy tells him to shut up because they must battle. Fate doesn't know how he should approach the fight. Greed simply tells him to use the shield and smash the orcs. Fate then starts running with the shield in front of him. He blocks every attack and runs into the orcs, slicing them in half. Greed explains that shield bash, it requires some strength to use it, but Fate already has it. Fate continues running into the orcs, slicing every orc around. By the end, all his stats reach over 2 million once again. However, Fate is feeling surprised because his gluttony skill is quiet despite defeating several orcs. Greed asks if the skill became quiet after he defeated Haniel. Fate confirms and thinks it's because he trained to control the skill with Barbados. Greed accepts the possibility and tells him to cut the ears and return to the city. Once he returns, everyone is shocked to see that Fate defeated that many orcs alone. He gives them to the clerk, who's also shocked. However, one of the guys from before accuses Fate of stealing their orcs. Greed mentions that Fate actually saved them, but the guy tries to take Fate's bags away. Fate breaks the guy's hand, but the rest of the group decides to attack him. They all gang on him at the same time, but Fate defeats everyone with a single punch. The group leader throws a dagger and attacks Fate, but our boy blocks it with the bag and kicks him on his family insurance. In the end, Fate gets a payment of 100 gold. However, Roxy gets inside and asks if he's the one who knocked down this whole group. Fate is shocked but explains everything. Roxy realizes this was in self-defense, and Fate asks what she will do to him. Roxy claims he went too far, but she's responsible for the decline of security in battle, and because there's no holy knight to keep it on check, she decides to not only let Fate go, but the group of ugly guys will spend a night in jail for their misbehavior. Fate then realizes that he became taller than Roxy, but she asks if he hurt her. He replies that he did, but Miriam complains that it's rude to wear a mask in front of Roxy. Roxy is fine with it, especially because Mugen claims that a mask can be an important piece of equipment. Fate thanks her, and she asks his name. Fate replies he's Corpse. She asks him to not cause problems, and to learn how to dress with style. Fate gets shocked to hear it and runs away in panic. Everyone is confused by this, especially Mugen. He claims that Fate looks weak, but he managed to beat everyone. Minutes later, Fate is walking on the street, thinking that Roxy might hate him. Greed replies it's better than finding out his identity. The sword then takes advantage of Roxy's words to dress well and asks again for a scabbard. Suddenly, the guy from the previous store appears, mentioning that he heard that Fate managed to beat the ruffians. Fate sighs because people are gossiping, but the guy suddenly asks him to fight while wearing his clothes. Fate is confused, and the guy introduces himself as Jade, a craftsman. The guy explains he opened his shop 3 months ago and is still a nobody, so he wants Fate to use his equipment, therefore getting some sort of ad revenue. Jade explains he was looking for a great warrior to create this partnership, and since it's free gear, Fate accepts the deal. After some work, Fate now looks like Kirito with a mask. However, Jade asks for 80 gold coins in return. Just like us, Fate is shocked. Jade then asks for 40 gold coins instead, but still, he got scammed. Fate then decides to get some food and notices a bar filled up with people. Greed mentions the food there is delicious, but Fate just wants something cheap. He decides to walk away, when suddenly, a beautiful girl comes out of the bar. She looks at Fate, and she suddenly feels an impulse inside him. He cannot take his eyes off her. Greed mentions he's getting the hang of it, and the girl walks his way. The girl then calls by his name, mentioning she's been waiting for him. Fate is shocked because she knows his identity and name despite the mask. She laughs it out, saying they're both one of a kind. Fate realizes she's a deadly sin skill owner. She introduces herself as Eris the Lust. They get inside, and she tells him to remove his mask because she can see through it anyways. Fate notices something happens when he looks at her in the eyes. She apologizes, mentioning it's an effect of her lust skill. In short, the skill makes everyone to fall in love with her. Fate asks what she means by stating that she was waiting for him. She reveals she's been watching him for a long time since he was in the capital. She explains she wanted to contact him after he awakened his gluttony skill. However, she didn't contact him before because she was waiting for him to meet Greed. Fate asks if she knows about mine too. Eris claims she doesn't know much about mine because she's a first-generation deadly skin owner. She explains that just like Fate, she's second generation. Fate is confused, but she explains that she isn't in good terms with mine because she has more plot. Eris then thanks him for defeating Haniel, and Fate asks if she knows everything. She replies that she doesn't know who put the cocoon there. She then explains there's a lot more chimeras, and it will be hard to deal when they evolve. She claims the Holy Knights will have a hard time to beat them. She then wants to talk with him about the main topic. She explains that she has two identities. One is a deadly skill user, and the second is a guardian of the kingdom. In short, she holds the kingdom's interests above individuals when it comes to the future, and she wants the kingdom to prosper for the next 1,000 years, even if she suffers a defeat now. Fate asks what she is getting at. Eris replies that Roxy must die in the Galia expedition. Fate gets angry at Eris, but she asks if he knows about the hate phenomenon. She explains that hate builds up when he defeats monsters and accumulates over a long period of time. In the end, that hate generates a crown beast, and that happens to humans too. Fate is confused, but she replies that hate is also accumulated by the people who have suffered. In this case, it's generated by oppression, discrimination, and poverty caused by holy knights. Roxy is the only holy knight who cares about people, so if she dies, it will create a huge amount of hatred, which will swallow all the other hate, and give birth to a human being with a new power, and that being will give birth to those with superior skills to help the kingdom. Eris claims that Roxy's death will lead the kingdom to a bright future, but Fate gets angry, denying it. He claims that no good thing will be created from Roxy's death. He walks away, but Eris reveals that nobody can stop it because the plans are already in motion. However, Fate doesn't care about the opponent or intentions. He will protect Roxy at any cost.